događanjima iz različitih kuteva i perspektiva, a sve s ciljem boljeg razumijevanja sadašnjosti i vremena u kojima se nalazimo. Rijeka je imala vrlo bogatu i kompleksnu povijest kroz koju su se ispreplitali snažni utjecaji i sile različitih zemalja. No danas ćemo se fokusirati na razdoblje nakon Prvog svjetskog rata, nakon pada monarhije i okupacije grada od strane Gabrielea D'Annunzia i njegovih fašista koji Rijeku žele pripojiti Italiji. Zato nam je veliko zadovoljstvo što danas imamo priliku i čast ugostiti jednu vrlo zanimljivu i osebujnu osobu, američku povjesničarku, autoricu knjige Fiume Crisis, gospođu Dominique Kirchner Reill, koja će kroz predavanje izložiti svoja saznanja. Naravno, s nama je danas i naš dragi gost, uvaženi hrvatski povjesničar, gospodin profesor dr. Tvrtko Jakovina, s Odsjeka za povijest Filozofskog fakulteta u Zagrebu, koji će nakon predavanja voditi jedan zanimljiv razgovor s autoricom i vama, draga publiko. Današnje predavanje održat će se na engleskom jeziku uz osiguran simultani prijevod na hrvatski jezik, pa se slobodno poslužite slušalicama koje smo pripremili ispred vas. No prije svega pozivam našeg gradonačelnika, gospodina Vojka Obersnela, da vas sve srdačno pozdravi. Izvolite, gradonačelniče.
Dobar dan i srdečan pozdrav svima. Naravno, posebno pozdravio našu gošću, profesoricu Dominique Kirchner Reill i rekao bih profesora Tvrtka Jakovinu, koji baš i više nije naš gost, jer je u zadnje vrijeme toliko često u Rijeci. Da je riječka povijest zanimljiva, mislim da je to već poznato svima, a evo, najbolji dokaz je u stvari da u roku od 2 tjedna predstavljamo 2 knjige koje se bave istim područjem. Prošli tjedan smo predstavili knjigu Giacomo Scottija, rekao bih naturaliziranog Riječanina, Talijana, koji je skupio dokumentaciju upravo o ovom razdoblju koje je pobudilo toliko interesa za Rijeku na kraju Prvog svjetskog rata, a danas imamo prilike poslušati predavanje profesorice Reill o knjizi koju je ona napisala, Fiume Crisis, koja se bavi u stvari istom tom tematikom. Kako je u stvari došlo do cijele ove priče? Na jednom od naših susreta profesor Jakovina me upozorio na ovu knjigu. Moram priznati da sam ju zahvaljujući Amazonu kupio čim se pojavila u prodaji i istog trena sam nekako osjetio potrebu da profesoricu Reill dovedemo u Rijeku, u čemu je naravno profesor Jakovina imao značajnu ulogu, a i eto, sreća je htjela da profesorica Reill bude na studijskom boravku u našoj neposrednoj blizini, pa je to bilo lakše nego da samo zbog ovoga dolazi iz Amerike i Sjedinjenih Američkih Država gdje živi i radi. Naravno, povjesničari imaju pogled na povijest na temelju dokumenata koje sakupe. Ne moraju svi uvijek imati isti stav, ne moraju imati svi jednaku percepciju onoga što se dešavalo, ali je vrlo važno da pišu o tim događanjima i prikupljaju uvijek neke nove podatke. No, o tomu će više sigurno profesorica Reill, pa nema potrebe da ja govorim. No, mogu reći da živimo u jednom izuzetnom gradu koji, kao što vidimo, budi interes u gotovo svakoj svjetskoj krizi. Rijeka, kao jedan relativno mali grad, je bila u sjedištu svjetske politike upravo krajem Prvog svjetskog rata zbog svega što se dešavalo, zbog raspada Austro-Ugarske monarhije, zbog stvaranja nekih novih država, zbog naravno iscrtavanja nekih novih granica koje se baš uvijek nisu poklapale sa nacionalnim sastavom nekog područja i naravno u tome je sigurno značajnu ulogu imao i Gabriele D'Annunzio sa svojim pokušajem da na neki način preotme Rijeku ili zauzme Rijeku, čemu se između ostalog protivila i službena talijanska politika koja je nažalost 3 godine nakon što je istjerala D'Annunzia napravila upravo to. Silom prekršila međunarodne sporazume i pripojila Rijeku Italiji. I tako je bilo do 1945. a nakon vojne pobjede i oslobađanja Rijeke od strane nacističkih snaga, kao i obično započele su ponovo igre oko granica i u stvari bez obzira na vojnu pobjedu tadašnje Narodno-oslobodilačke vojske trebao je opet dugi niz godina koji je tek Pariškim mirovnim sporazumom definirao granice u kojima se nalazimo danas i Slovenija i Hrvatska, a sve je onda u konačnici na neki način kulminiralo Osimskim sporazumom koji nisu bili tako davno, 70. godina, čime je definitivno, ja bih rekao, stavljena točka na i, ili barem tako svi želimo vjerovati, u odnosima između Italije i ondašnje Jugoslavije, odnosno danas Slovenije i Hrvatske. Danas smo zajedno u ujedinjenoj Europi i to je dobro i dobro je da te granice postaju sve manje važne, da su one na nekoj simboličkoj razini, ali zbog razumijevanja povijesti važno je da imamo prilike čuti ljude koji imaju što reći o ovoj temi. Evo samo još jedna rečenica. Rijeka je tih godina krajem Drugog svjetskog rata bila zanimljiva ne samo zbog političkih igara koje su se igrale oko nje, nego i zbog činjenice što je Rijeka tada bila daleko važniji grad od njezine veličine. Rijeka je na kraju, dakle u Habsburškoj monarhiji, bila jedan od najrazvijenijih industrijskih gradova u Habsburškoj monarhiji. Tome imamo prilike svjedočiti po činjenici, evo imamo danas palaču šećerane i koja je u stvari predstavljala sjedište jedne od najmoćnijih tvrtki u ondašnjoj Austro-Ugarskoj monarhiji. Rijeka je bila grad koja je imala vezu sa željeznicom i prema Beču i prema Budimpešti. Rijeka je bila važna luka i za ondašnji dio austrijskog dijela carstva, a još više za mađarski dio carstva i to je također važno naglasiti, dakle da nije tu bilo pitanje samo političkog utjecaja uzrokovanog nekakvim nacionalnim idejama, nego je to bio i nastojanje dobivanja u tom segmentu jednog važnog, gospodarski važnog grada. No, u svakom slučaju, evo, drago mi je da imamo danas priliku čuti profesoricu Reill i sa zadovoljstvom ću vas prepustiti upravo njoj.
Ali prije nego profesorica Reill krene, ja ću samo reći nekoliko riječi o profesorici Reill. Da. O tebi ću reći nešto. Poštovani gradonačelniče, poštovane kolegice i kolege, poštovani kolege povjesničari i ljubitelji povijesti. Ja i Dominik se znamo sada već jako dugo. Ona je, nažalost, 20 godina. Ona je bila u Zagrebu, kao što to čine mnogi koji se bave našom povijesti, koja je došla učiti ili usavršavati hrvatski jezik, jedan od brojnih jezika koje je učila ili koje govori, ali kad jedanput se rodite u Los Angelesu i u engleskom govornom području, živite u Göttingenu, onda je lako naučiti još italijanski i hrvatski i sve ove druge jezike koje je naučila. Nakon studija u Stanfordu Magisterij i doktorat je stekla na Kolumbiji, mjestu koje je jedno od mjesta na istočnoj obali Sjedinjenih Država gdje se jako dobro može studirati, naročito ono što je vezano za austro-ugarski prostor, dok je tamo još bio profesor Deak i njegovi nasljednici i slično. I tu se negdje pojavila znatiželja za ovaj prostor sjevernog Jadrana, od kojega je onda interes se proširio i na ostali dio ili na širi dio tog prostora. Međutim, kao što je bio naslov jednog važnog članka od još više od 20 godina, No history is local history, or there is no local history, ako ju napišete na način koji može, ili ako je napišete tako da to zapravo, ili kroz njega možete ispričati, onda i kroz lokalnu povijest možete ispričati svjetsku priču. Rijeka doduše je pogodnija nego mnogi drugi gradovi za takvu priču, naročito Rijeka u nekim epizodama, i kao što će Dominik danas pokazati, jedan od ključeva zbog čega je ova knjiga bila predstavljena već 20-ak puta u Chicagu, Stanfordu, Padovi, na sveučilištu Vanderbilt, Kolumbiji, u Firenci, Ateni, Amsterdamu i Rijeci na samome početku online. Ovo je prvo predstavljanje u Rijeci uživo, možda i prvo predstavljanje uživo. Možda, nisam. Prvo predstavljanje uživo, tako da je očito interes koji prelazi naše granice vrlo velik za Rijeku, ako se povijest o Rijeci na taj način napiše. Čuli smo ovdje nekoliko tih odrednica, danuncija, protofašizam, ili ono što se u literaturi često tako govori, nacionalizam, grad koji je bio 9. luka u Europi po važnosti, grad koji je imao 15.000 stanovnika otprilike, ali je bio nešto što bi se moglo usporediti sa novim gradovima na Divljem zapadu, koji je tako brzo rastao i koji je bio mjesto za obogatiti se ili se ostvariti preko noći, ili ono što bi u Europi tada bilo preko noći. Sad je tvoj trenutak, tako da...
Hvala. Baš mi je žao da neću na hrvatskom, zato što moj hrvatski svaka godina da nisam tu gori. Onda ja ću na svojom, ali razumijem što vi ste rekli, baš mi je lijepo. Najvažnija stvar je da ja sam išao u Berkeley, ne Stanford. Stanford je naš neprijatelj, onda go Cal. Ne, ali prva knjiga je izašla sa Stanfordom, zbog toga mislim da ti si ova čudna stvar rekao. Dobro, ja ću na engleskom. Ne radi. So, I want to explain a couple of things about the book. First thing, for some reason the slide isn't working correctly, is why is it called the Fiume Crisis and not the Rijeka Crisis? I did not choose to call it the Fiume Crisis because I am saying that this was an Italian city. As everyone here knows, Rijeka was the name of the city, just like Fiume was for hundreds of years. The reason why I call it Fiume and not Rijeka is because I'm not talking about today's Rijeka. I'm not talking about the whole city. I'm talking about the Corpus Separatum, and Sushak and all the other areas, Kantrida, they were not part of the story, although they were very important characters in trying to understand why the Corpus Separatum idea was important. So in order to not confound, in order to not confuse a history of today's Rijeka with a history of the Corpus Separatum, I chose to use the word Fiume. That obviously will always be problematic, and one would also wonder why use the name of a city that actually doesn't exist anymore. And this book was not written for people who know anything about this area. This book was written for Americans. So calling it the Fiume Crisis was a strange choice in terms of, if an American opened up a map of the world, they're not going to find Fiume anywhere. So it really was a decision about thinking about the, oh, there it is, why the Fiume Crisis and not the Rijeka Crisis, about thinking about emphasizing the legal category, the economic category of Fiume corpus separatum and not Fiume city. As Tretko just said, the goal of the book is to push aside the histories we already have of this time period. So to think about post-World War I, think about Rijeka Fiume, and not only talk about D'Annunzio. Not only think about what this charismatic guy in his convertible car who arrived September 12th, 1919, and the couple hundred followers from the Italian military and others, veterans, what their story was and why that was important for the history of Italy and for maybe the foundational myths of Italian fascism. My goal was to not tell that story and to think about the city. So it's not just not the D'Annunzio crisis, it's also not the Legionnaire crisis, right? So there's a long-standing history that we need to look at Fiume in 1919 in order to understand charisma and populism, in order to understand how modern politics changed after World War I around paramilitarism. That's all interesting if the main characters are those really scary-looking guys in the bottom. But what about the 50,000 or more people who lived in Fiume before the war, during the war, and after the war? What if we told a history about daily life after empire? What if we weren't just looking at the man on the balcony and the guys who came to follow him and clap when he talked on the balcony? What if we focused on a city, typical Habsburg city, of a mixed ethnic, religious, linguistic population where the more than half of the population did not identify as mother tongue Italian? How do you explain this story from 1918 to 1921, where annexation to Italy was the major political movement in this town, if the majority of the people living in the town would not be considered Italian? How does this work? Why is this happening? And why isn't there more violence? Why is the history of Fiume in 1918 to 1921 not something like Munich or Budapest or the Freikorps in Lithuania or the Baltics? Why aren't we thinking about Fiume the way we think of Macedonia in this time, of enormous strife around ethnicity, if the town was as mixed as it was? So that was the goal of the book, is to try and understand, how did life keep on going with all of these reasons for it to turn into an explosive situation? And what I found in the book was that there were lots of things happening on a day-to-day level to try and keep people from exploding, to try and keep life going on, even though the state that had organized this big boom, as the mayor just said, had disappeared, that the Habsburg state unexpectedly dissolved in November 1918. The book is divided into a short introduction and a short conclusion, and then 5 chapters. The first chapter is kind of everything we tell about Fiume and why it's weird. But the real book starts in chapter 2, and it talks about what is money when the state that makes money disappears. And chapter 3 is, what is law when the state that made the laws disappear? And chapter 4 is, what is citizenship when the country that made citizenship disappears? And the final chapter, and I'm going to talk just for a little bit about the final chapter, is about nationalism and propaganda and education. How do you make a city Italianissima when it's not? Before I go into this, I just want to say why this book took so long, and it's because it's highly dependent on the archives, and it would be impossible to have written this book without the enormous help of the Državni archiv u Rijeci without the enormous help of Boris Sakošek and Mladen Urim. For 7 years, these two men helped me track down every weird character, every strange phenomenon, oftentimes without much success, but they literally did much more than you should ever expect from an archivist. And they did it because they thought it was exciting and because they care. So I just want to say, for me it's very important to say this in Rijeka, is that this book is dependent on all the people who have worked so hard to help me put Rijeka back in its own history. So just a little sliver from the book. I want to talk about education and maps and geography. This idea of where is Rijeka, where is Fiume after the war? Before while Woodrow Wilson is arguing with all the other diplomats in Paris during the peace treaties, while D'Annunzio is trying to get everyone all excited about taking over Fiume in Rome, while the kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes is getting formed in Belgrade and Zagreb. What is happening on the ground in Fiume about trying to think of what their position is going to be in the world? In order to understand it, you can't start by thinking in 1918. You have to think about how were they training themselves and their children in schools about where they sat in the world before the war. Now, I'm in Rijeka, and everybody here knows this already, but I'll just repeat very quickly what our mayor just said, is Rijeka was a semi-independent city-state in the Kingdom of Hungary within the Austro-Hungarian monarchy. And that is precisely how a child in school was trained to think of where Fiume or Rijeka sat in the world. I looked up all of the school council records. The only maps in any of the schools in Fiume before 1918 were the maps you see right here. They were the maps of the city, the maps of Hungary and where Fiume sits in Hungary, and then I don't have the third one, maps of Europe. Those are the only maps that children saw in their schools in 1917 or 1912. And I want to say very quickly, these are actually the school maps. Agnes Odasi, who is a wonderful historian who just finished her PhD in Budapest on the history of Fiume Rijeka. She's now has a job in the National Archives in Budapest, and she sent me these high-definition versions of the school maps. So this is what we're seeing is what a child would be learning. So what a child would be learning before 1918 is a hierarchical structure of the world in which the first thing they would learn is Fiume, then they would learn Hungary, then they would learn Austria-Hungary, and then they would learn Europe. But everything began on where does Fiume sit and how is everything related to Fiume. In 1918, as many of you probably have read in all the newspapers about the Spanish influenza, because how can we not talk about the Spanish influenza after COVID? All the schools were closed, just like we experienced at the beginning of the pandemic here. So when the Habsburg monarchy disappeared, there wasn't an immediate response in the school education because schools didn't open until January 1919. But in December 1918, while they were trying to organize how are we going to open the schools, what do we need the kids to learn to make up for the fact that they lost 4 months of school, all the same problems we had when the schools were closed, they decided to do this. And you can see this quote at the bottom. They decided the geography curriculum is going to remain unchanged. This is fascinating. The Habsburg monarchy does not exist anymore, nor does the Kingdom of Hungary. So they say, the geography curriculum will remain unchanged, though the books will be withdrawn. So there is something that's going to change. Geography will be taught on the basis of the old curriculum with due reservations and modifications rendered necessary following the new conditions of the city. I think many of us know how bureaucracy talks. This is all very unclear. Nothing's going to change, but everything's going to change because everything's changing, but it's all the same. They go on further to explain how to do it. So this is how they're going to do it. It's possible to not change anything but still change everything because everything is based on Fiume, right? All of these geography lessons are about, as you can see here, they treat the logo nazio. And so the only thing we have to do, and you'll see it at the very thing, is to teach the geography of Italy in place of the geography of Hungary. So if you go back to what you think, how they were teaching geography before World War I, first Fiume, then Hungary, then the Habsburg monarchy, then Europe, they're like, it's going to be easy. We just do Fiume, and then we'll just put in that Italy thing where Hungary was. So instead of learning about the Hungarian plains, we're going to learn about Tuscany in that section of the book. But most of the geography is actually about Fiume, so we'll be fine. How does that really work? So then they start writing out the lesson plans. This is a lesson plan for children around 8 or 9 years old. This is how you teach the world. The baby or the child is the heart of the family. This is a geography lesson, okay? Love and your responsibilities to the single member of the family. The family is a small society. The school society is like bigger society, just in small. The responsibilities towards your teachers and towards your fellow students. This is a geography lesson. I need to keep on reminding you what's going on here. They're creating a vision of the world that starts at home, then goes to your school, then goes to your neighborhood, then goes to your city, then goes to your district. By the time you get to the end of the school year, you're lucky if you've gotten to Sushak, right? Because you're just going little, little, little. Everything that matters is us. And then, if you look towards the bottom, if any of you know Italian, we talk about Cosala, we talk about Drenova, Place, and then at the very end, we get to concepts of physical geography. So hopefully by July, they've gotten to what is a mountain. But what they're learning is what is the mountains outside of Fiume. And when they're learning about what is a river, they're learning about the Fiumara. So everything in the first year of geography is actually just Fiume Rijeka. This is the world that they're taught to imagine in geography class. And if they're taught to teaching anything broader, it's this, the district. 9 and 10-year-olds have a different geography thing. They are going to be taught about what we might consider geography. But look at what they're getting taught. They're getting taught what is a geographical map and how do you use it. What is the Istrian Peninsula? What is orography and hydrography? All of this is about learning where are the natural resources I can use to make money with. Then we're going to get to the coastline. We're going to learn about il litorale croato. It's fascinating that they're admitting that the area around Buka and Sen is Croatian. Then they're going to learn about the islands. Then they're going to learn about Dalmatia, so the Adriatic. And only then do you hear about Italy. Then you hear about plains and gulfs and rivers, and then you get to the Alps and the Apennines. So Italy comes at the end, maybe in July for the 9 and 10-year-olds old, comes at the end. All of this is the vision that 9 and 10-year-olds are getting of the new post-Habsburg world. It's the Adriatic. And if it's anything larger, it's this. If you want to consider the time period from 1918 to 1921 as proto-fascism, right, which is one of the normal arguments when you talk about the nuncio, when you talk about the legionnaires, you talk about annexation to Italy, you talk about the Italianization of Fiume, so erasing the Croatian, Slovene, Hungarian, German speakers from the imagination of the city. I think this is as close as you get in lived terms of how they start reimagining Fiume's place in a map very similar to the fascist maps that these children are going to be forced to learn after 1924. So this is as much as I see a connection between what we call proto-fascism and fascism, is the erasure of the Habsburg Empire and the replacement of an Italian empire, thinking about Italy and Fiume in imperial terms. They say it point blank. All we have to do is replace Hungary with Italy. And this is what I see in 1918 to 1921, replacing the state you lost with a state that exists, with nationalism involved, with all sorts of other stuff. But I don't feel a lot of that D'Annunzio energy going on in the day-to-day life of how to keep the city working. So the book does similar things to what I just showed with the geography lesson. It's really going, how did things work? How did money work? How did law work? How did citizenship work? And why I wrote this book, and I just, the journalist asked me, how did you get to this? I've always been interested in why Rijeka is always told in terms of Italian history instead of its own. That is why I ended up writing this book. But I don't think it's actually just about Rijeka. I think it's about all of the post-Habsburg lands. I think this question of what do you do when your state disappears, and a lot of the problem solving that we see in the Fumey case is incredibly similar to what is happening everywhere on that map of the world that once was and the new nation states that are coming. So this is what the book is trying to do. I think it is related, as Amir just said, it is related to all these other books that are coming up with Fumey, but the main characters are different. They're not the fancy leaders and the names we all know. They're just the daily life of life in the wake of the Habsburg monarchy. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ja ću odmah zapravo dati mogućnost da postavite pitanje, ali možda na samome početku sljedeća konstatacija ili nešto na što bi se možda mogla referirati. Prva knjiga o kojoj ja nisam, koju ovdje nisam spomenuo, to je ona sa Stanforda, odnosno Stanford University Press, je naslovljena Nationalists Who Feared the Nation, Adriatic Multinationalism in Habsburg, Dalmatia, Trieste and Venice. Je bila knjiga koja je u fokusu imala one koji bi bili velike, snažne ličnosti. Ova knjiga je to okrenula. Međutim, ono što se ovdje spomenula i pokazala sliku je bio Riječki arhiv. To nije prva knjiga o Rijeci i nisu prve knjige o, naravno, D'Annunciju, međutim, pogled je bio drugačiji. Što je to? Dakle, ti si s jedne strane došla u centralni arhiv o Rijeci, u Rijeci, ali je on ostao zapravo u drugom planu za cijelu tu priču. Kako je to bilo moguće?
Well, does this work? Hello? No?
I guess.
Okay. Yes? Whatever. When I came to Rijeka, I had never worked in the archive before, and I came and I met Boris and I introduced myself and I showed the little card. And I said, I would like to work on this time period. And he said, we don't have any of that stuff. The Italians took it. And in a certain way, what he said was absolutely true. Because the history of D'Annunzio and the history of the Italian state trying to take Rijeka most of that stuff isn't here. It's in the Vittoriale, in the villa where D'Annunzio lives. It's in Rome, in the military archives, in the government archives, in the state archives. And some of the family archives are in the Museo Fiumano in Rome as well. But then when I started talking to Boris, he's like, oh, that? Oh, yeah, we have all of that. When it wasn't the history of D'Annunzio, but it was the history of the town, then everything changed. And I mean, we have many people here who study this and who have used this archive. It is so enormous. It is so rich. And it's been ignored because it doesn't help you tell the D'Annunzio story. And because the Fiume Crisis has always, not always, but almost always been seen as the D'Annunzio crisis, this archive has been underused. So I was like a little baby in a candy shop here because it was so fun to work in this. And it changed I could never write this book, as I said, without the Rijeka archive. but I don't think anyone should write histories of Fiume anymore without using the Rijeka arc.
To bilo je dosta logično.
Pa dobra, ali za Talijanima nije tako.
Zato sam ispomenuo ove jezike zapravo na samom početku. Prije 1 godinu dana ovdje je bila, ili manje od pola godine, ovdje je bio skup o Rapalskom ugovoru i ja sam zamolio kolegu koji je sada u New Yorku da mi izvuče sve stranice New York Timesa koje spominju Rijeku. I to je bilo nevjerojatno koliko je tih članaka i kako to izgleda. Međutim, svejedno kad smo kod Danuncija i automobila, koji sam ja vidio prvi puta na jednoj izložbi u Forliju i koji izgleda apsolutno maestralno, gotovo nevjerojatno. Međutim, svejedno pitanje koje si dobila. On dolazi sa određenom skupinom ljudi ovdje koji su razočarani ili željni avanture ili tako dalje. Oni ovdje žive. Što jedu, gdje spavaju, tko to plaća, kako se griju Riječani, ovaj papir kojeg je nastavnica geografije imala, od kuda to dolazi, na koji način traje trgovina u gradu koji više nije u nekoj zemlji.
So I started the book, the time period is not 1919 to 1921, but 1918 to 1921, also when the inter-allied troops were here, so the British and the French and the Italians and the Americans. What happened at the initial time is the troops were put not just in the old Habsburg Kaserne, but also the schools were used, and officers were also allowed to live in private homes. When D'Annunzio came, the inter-allied troops basically left, and D'Annunzio's troops just basically took over that same situation of cohabitation, either in the old Habsburg army barracks, or with families, or renting out, or living also in the outside of Fiume as well. So you have a situation of daily life in which everything is mixed up. There are a lot more people here than there were kasernes. So you have, in that same chapter on the schools, you have problems where the schools are inhabited by the soldiers and they're trying to teach lessons about geography while drunk legionnaires are shooting birds and using the bathrooms as if they were made for grown-ups, and the teachers are all upset because grown-up poop and baby poop are different. So anyways, it's a mixed up world, but where the money is coming from is a combination of Fiume City covers a lot of the costs of the D'Annunzio expedition and the day-to-day life of these soldiers. The Italian state sends money, the Italian Red Cross sends money, nationalist organizations send money, and then there's a lot of crooked dealings going on in Fiume to make money out of this situation, and lots of money counterfeiting rings and selling stuff off they shouldn't be selling. So it is a history of, and there have been other historians who've talked about this, but where the money comes from is a great question because it's coming from a lot of places it shouldn't be. And it's being made and used in a lot of ways it shouldn't be. And D'Annunzio is absolutely aware of this. I mean, we have proof that he knows what's going on, and he has no problem with that.
Inače, kad bi morala ovako reći na pojednostavljeno pitanje, koga kriza koja traje godinama, sa svim tim ljudima koji su ovdje došli i drugačijim potrebama da se troši, koga najviše udara? One najsiromašnije? Ili one najbogatije, ili srednju klasu, tko je to s većom lakoćom proživi?
This was supposed to be the easier question. I mean, I think no matter what, the hardest hit are always the most vulnerable, right? There's a lot less room to wait it out if you're really poor. And the fact that the port is basically closed, the unemployment rates go through the roof. The city has gone through 4 years of war, so it wasn't doing so great economically before. It's not a center of commerce during the war years because commerce is basically at a standstill. And so we see the elites and the middle class are complaining a lot, rightly so, they are also suffering, but the worst hit are the poorest. And And, you know, I think that a lot of my argument about the stabilizing factor of the state is also because so many people are now dependent on the state for ration cards to get food or welfare initiatives, that maybe there is actually more power that this, you know, these are not geniuses of statecraft that are in charge of the Italian National Council, but they do have a population that needs help. And they do control the branches of administration, of administrating food, of administrating electricity, cold months ahead, that I think creates a situation with maybe greater willingness to work with the state. Hey!
Okay. I mean, I'll do the question in English. Ivan Jelicic, postdoc at the Department of History in Rijeka and also at the Institute of Political History in Budapest. So my question was, I mean, I think you didn't mention it here, but I think it's quite important, and it goes, basically, it connects to what Tvrtko said previously. And this is why this is a kind of a local history, but on the other side, a history of the former empire. I mean, you, in many presentations, said that Fiume is basically the smallest Habsburg successor state. So, could you tell us something more about this?
I did not write a history of the town. I wrote the history of the state. So, if you wanted to think about why this local history is actually not a local history, it's because it's looking at how do you make a state out of a ghost, right? How do you take the leftovers of something that once was working? You could say well, you could say poorly, but one way or the other, there was a structure there. And then how do you re-inhabit that structure in a new state environment? Because that's what I was trying to explain. It's not actually a local story. It's almost sociological. It's a structural history filled with people. And it's very little about what the people themselves were feeling, because I don't know that. I know how they're acting. I know what they're looking for, what they're angry about, but I don't know what they're dreaming of. I don't know what the hopes and dreams are. I know what the frustrations of the day are. So if you write a book like that, that's actually not about a mentality world, it is inherently easier to use as a comparative model, because it's about a ghost state and the people living it. So that's how I tried to do this. I don't know if it's a frustrating enterprise or not, but that was definitely the goal, was thinking, again, as Ivan just said, as Fiume as the smallest successor state. And then thinking every successor state has similar problems, and thinking what would it mean to tell the history of Poland the way I just tried to tell the history of Fiume. Oh, can you introduce yourself?
My name is journalist. Jako Kršovnik, journalist from Novi List, Croatian newspaper.
Yes.
Can you maybe elaborate on the fact that there was not much violence in Rijeka after the war, if I understood you correctly, but because as much as I know, I'm not an expert on this, but there was at least some strife between the nuncios, soldiers and Arditi, and the local population, and even I think the Italian population was not so fond of the Croatian and Slovene after the World War I. Can you maybe please elaborate on that?
There's definitely violence. I'm not saying there isn't any violence. It's just there's very little if you consider what it means to have irregular troops in the middle of a city center. That usually gets told as rape, fire, and blood spilling everywhere. There is definitely intimidation. There is rape. There is some moments of open violence after the split situation in the summer of 1920. However, it's nothing compared to what will come later, and it's nothing compared to what's going on other places. So if you think about Trieste and what's happening in Trieste, and you think about what's happening in Fiume, it's pretty surprising that Fiume isn't more like Trieste in terms of violence. That is all I'm saying there, is that this, if you look at how, I mean, it says so right here, Italia o morte, chi Fiume perisce, di Fiume perisce, that means whoever hurts Fiume, Italian Fiume, right? So none of these Croats or Slovenes or Germans or Hungarians is going to get hurt. I mean, this is all promising violence. So it's pretty surprising to me that there wasn't a lot more.
Yes, Vanni D'Alessio, University of Naples. Some collaboration here in Rijeka. You wrote the book, the first book about intellectuals and their multinational visions, to make it short. And here you didn't concentrate on visions, on people, you just said it. But, I mean, there was maybe a part of this 10 years research time in which you saw visions arising in those times you were reading and, you know, following people. Maybe they were not always, you know, high political figures, or sometimes they were, because there was a lot of writings from people who were not from Fiume in those times. But there was some elaboration, some thoughts of, you know, some visions. And how do you see them? And if you saw some even multinational ways to look at it?
So this is a time period where it's very unclear what's going to happen, right? So I did the full 3 years until the peace treaty and the Christmas of Blood, when the Italian government attacks the town to force D'Annunzio out. Over that time period, we had the inter-allied forces here, we have the Paris Peace Treaty going on, we have Wilson getting sick, we have all these moments that are different between 1918 and 1921 about thinking about what could be possible. So if you're thinking about what would someone be dreaming in, I'll just say, April 1919, when Wilson says to the Italian delegation, point blank, that Italy will never get Fiume, you can have dreams that are very different than November 1920, when Fiume is told point blank, it has to be independent. Or, you know, if we keep on going, what one dreams is often contextualized by what could be possible or what seems scary. So you're right, I've seen many, many things, and there is the socialists in 1918 specifically talk in multinational ways. You also have the autonomists, some of them are thinking about this localism that is above, you know, Fiuman, it's not Italian, you know, so you have moments where you could maybe talk about multinationalism, but I would feel uncomfortable about giving it any of those kind of the categorization of this is what people are thinking. I would say really annoying things like in April 1919, but I wouldn't be able to say after World War I, because I think things are changing a lot all the time. Gulia?
Gulia Vadescu, University of Constance. We had the amazing pleasure to have Dominique giving a fantastic talk last week on Zoom, and now what a treat to actually see you in person in Rijeka. So actually, I wanted to go back to these maps that were shown in classes. So it's interesting, it's the Rijeka Fiume, it's the Hungarian and Europe. So Austria-Hungary did not have a map. So my question then would be, Habsburgness versus Hungarianness. What do you find in this period? To what extent are there references to the idea of Habsburg past and Hungarian past? Because also if you think of the decision to put the bird back on the tower, it's a Habsburg symbol. Right. But to what extent is Habsburg, to what extent is Hungarian in this particular period? Yeah. As the map is definitely Hungarian.
It's such a great question. So what Fiume, we always think of it as a border between Croatia and Italy, or between Croatian nationality and Italian nationality. But before World War I, it was the border between Hungary and Austria, right? So, you know, Cantrida was Austria, Fiume, Coppa Separatum was Hungary, Sushak was Hungary. So the border between, it wasn't between what we think of the Fiume. It's actually between the two parts of the empire. And Fiume makes a lot of money also because of that. So when I looked at my sources, they are talking a lot about Hungary, right? They're talking about Hungarian law, Hungarian citizenship things, Hungarian. But when it's talking about money, it's Habsburg. So what I see, because again, going back to Vani's question, I did not focus on political ideology. I focused on daily problem solving. I only felt the Habsburg stuff in the money chapter. And I felt Hungary in the other chapters, which kind of makes sense because in everything else it was Hungary, it wasn't Habsburg. But Fiume was not just a Hungarian port town, it was connecting. It didn't just have the train line that goes to Vienna and Budapest, it also had it to go to Trieste. Which is connecting the two ports, Austria's port and Hungary's port. So I think that how much is there Habsburg loyalty and how much is there Hungarianness? It's hard to say, also because there is a revolution going on in that moment in Hungary. And which Hungary are we feeling loyal to? The one that might go socialist, the one that's anti-socialist, or the Habsburg one? So Hungary is also a changing category.
Ja sam obećao, bez obzira što sam ovdje nekoliko puta apostrofiran kao već skoro građanin Rijeke, ali rekao da sam jednu od epizoda koje su u knjizi opisane prvi puta čuo, što može biti moja veliki minus, međutim svejedno volio bih da kažeš nešto o posljednjih nekoliko stranica. Zašto knjigu završavaš sa i o kome uopće pišeš?
Da. So how it ends?
Zašto završavaš s tom epizodom?
So you're talking about Palatucci? So I end the book with the caso of Palatucci, and I think a lot of people here know that story. It was quite a scandal. You know, the great Italian Schindler in Fiume, who supposedly saved hundreds of Jews from the evil Germans. I'm sorry, it's very hard for me to tell that story with any seriousness because it's so upsetting to me that people still believe that Palatucci is the victim of the Holocaust and that somehow it's bad to say, no, this guy was a fascist police officer. I was just at Rizzeria San Saba at the Holocaust Museum there, and to see his name be the name of the street going to where people were put in gas chambers, I find deeply problematic. But why I end the book with Palatucci is to say the Fiume story has been treated the way it has in order to give a linear explanation of how we got from World War I to fascism. And so D'Annunzio and the Legionnaires and the Fiume story that is the most commonly known story serves to connect the anger over the war, the soldiers who no longer trust their state, the charismatic leader, paramilitarism, extreme Italian nationalism, and you can take you from 1918 to 1922 with the March on Rome, where the March on Fiume is the first episode to get you to the March on Rome. Why Palatucci? Well, how did we get to the point of thinking Palatucci is the victim of the Holocaust? We get there because he died in Dachau. And so you abstract pieces of information and you assume someone dies in Dachau because of the Holocaust. And so you don't do a lot of research into actually figuring out why he was in Dachau, because he was in Dachau. So of course it must be that he was some kind of hero of the Holocaust. That must just be it. It's a linear assumption that that's why he's there. And my book is trying to give a moment of history about the people who lived in this town that has nothing to do with fascism, because fascism isn't the big player here yet. And maybe it's okay to spend time to think about people's lives and how they live without trying to explain what comes after. Let's respect what actually happened and what was important to people, instead of always looking to get to the next step, because we might make some huge errors about trying to understand what the reasons are for why things happen, like the enormous error of seeing Palatucci as this grand hero of Fiume. And that's why I ended it the way I did. Super, baš. Scientific.
Možda još neko komentar?
I'm Orietta Bressan, journalist for La Voce del Popolo. I would like to ask a question about, actually I would like to ask if you could just tell us, in your opinion, some of the good and some of the bad examples of dealing with multiculturalism and multi-identity. I mean, in the whole crisis of Fiume that you talk about, were there actually some good examples of dealing with this multitude of cultures, identities, and so on?
Oh, I wish I could think of good examples. Isn't that terrible that all I can think of is bad examples? Tvitko mentioned how he had asked his friends for how often Fiume was mentioned in the newspapers. I found a newspaper report by an American, African-American, who was in Fiume trying to report on what was happening. He couldn't get a room in a hotel in Fiume. It was filled, not because, whatever. So he stayed with a family in Sušak, a Croatian family. And they spent the whole time telling him everything that he's been told is a lie, and that Fiume isn't an Italian city, and that no one trusts this Italian National Council, and that this is all propaganda and all this stuff. But in his telling about what his landlady was saying to him, is he also describes a city in which, don't believe the lie, we all live together. Right? So there are moments throughout the archives where people are living together. They're just the way they were before. So I don't have any heroic moments of saying, and then they came and saved everyone. What I do have is maybe the entire book is about the city still exists. It is not Italianissima. It is filled with Croatians, Slovenes, Hungarians, Germans, Jews, what have you, and they are all trying to survive. And there are examples of mean nationalists, and there are examples of people beating each other up or trying to get each other kicked out of town because they don't want Croats here, or they don't. But there's actually much more that is just of people going, I need milk for my baby, I was standing in line, and we don't know what their nationality is. We're hearing about people looking for milk for their baby. So the best examples I can think of you is the city that kept on going is the best multicultural example. There are nationalist memes though. It's not all happy stories, but yes.
Okay. Samo jedan komentar prije nego odjednom onda, kad si pokazala ove karte koje pokazuju isključivo ugarski dio monarhije, jednoga dana kad ne manje od 10 godina Hrvatska, koja je opsjednuta prošlosti, konačno dobije svoj povijesni muzej, onda će u Zagrebu biti, ako do tako to napravimo, sa stalnim zaskorom, užasni problem će biti na koji način pokazati hrvatske krajeve u Austro-Ugarskoj, zbog toga što sve karte koje su u Zagrebu nigdje ne pokazuju Dalmaciju sa Slavonijom i Hrvatskom, a pogotovo nema cijeline i celina drugačije. Tako da će to biti veliki problem za muzealce jednoga dana. budućnosti, ali predlažem da kad se idući puta s tobom oko neke knjige ovdje nađemo, da to bude zbog knjige The Habsburg Mayor of New York, La Guardia, o čemu Dominik sada piše knjigu sa jednim poglavljem o Rijeci, drugim poglavljem o nekim drugim gradovima, pa to može biti dobar trenutak za budući sastav. Hvala lijepa domaćinima, hvala lijepa vama.
Hvala